So you're a young pastor and you've got a traditional church, right? You didn't church plant. You just inherited this congregation that's been around for a while. What are your first moves to help see the church thrive again, or maybe thrive for the first time? Let's dive in. Shouldn't young leaders simply plant new churches? I mean, isn't that a better idea? Well, when I started out in ministry, I began leading 3 small, honestly dying traditional churches. And it was a challenge. I mean, they hadn't grown in decades. And I had to figure out exactly what to do, and it was not easy. However, it is possible. I had a leader I respected tell me when I explained the situation, I've got these 3 little churches that can't afford a full-time pastor, so they hired me. I was actually still in seminary at the time, and I was affordable, right? I was gettable. I remember telling him, we're going to rejuvenate these dying traditional churches, and he told me, look, it's easier to give birth than raise the dead. In other words, cut your losses, just go plant a church. But I told them, look, I believe in a God who specializes in resurrection. And you know what? Those churches would go on to grow. We would leave the original historic buildings within 5 years, move to an elementary school, build a brand new facility. Then we transitioned into a non-denominational church, which by the time I left had an attendance of over 1,000 and was really a church where 3,000 or 4,000 people called the church home. So transformation is possible. I believe in a God who specializes in resurrection, and that's what I think you can see too in your midst. So on that note, I want to look at the numbers before I show you exactly what to do if you're in that situation where you're a young pastor leading a traditional church. I want you to think about the numbers for a moment, because it is a good question, like why doesn't everybody just plant a new church and let the dying church die? For every new church planted in America today, 3 traditional existing churches close their doors forever. Yep, that's 3 churches closing for every new church planted. And the majority of church closures are existing traditional churches, congregations with deep roots and rich histories who've just had a really hard time. So if you think about that, mathematically, it makes sense to help rejuvenate those churches because there are way more of them than there are church plants. And I've worked with countless young leaders pastoring traditional churches who tell me, I just started ministry at a traditional church. What do I need to do? A lot of people say, well, I'm going to target the music. I'm going to transform the preaching style. We'll get some technology and get a nice LED screen and some lights, and, everything will be fine. Well, clearly, those are things you probably at some point need to tackle, but those are not the places you probably want to start. You can probably change all of that and miss most of what you need to focus on. In fact, the church could die. I've seen it happen. If all you're focusing on is the form, you're going to make a mistake, okay? You can get a TikTok account, but your TikTok account is just going to attract people to a dying church. That's kind of weird now because you've got all this technology, all right? So what I would do if you're a young leader is I would start to focus on 5 critical shifts that I think traditional churches need to make to see genuine rebirth and sustainable growth. So what's the first change you need to make? Well, I would say number 1, elevate the mission over the methods. See, walking into some traditional churches, it feels like stepping in a museum. You can literally smell a year. You walk into a church, it's like 1987, or, in some cases, 1948, right? Okay. I mean, churches just have that old museum-like feeling. And in those churches, often preservation trumps purpose. Methods have become more sacred than the mission. Now, I'm not saying history doesn't matter. I walked into 3 very historic churches. One dated back to 1840. They all had stained glass. They were beautiful facilities that dated back to the 19th century. And history matters, okay? I personally have a degree in history, but no congregation can let the methods of the past become more sacred than the mission that is eternal. And that's the first lesson you've got to kind of walk your congregation through. So the question becomes, what do you do? Well, what you want to do is you want to honor the past without living in it. I learned that from a Disney Imagineer. And if you think about Disney, I mean, Mickey Mouse is over 100 years old. They have masterfully preserved Walt's vision, but they're continually innovating how they deliver it. The theme park that you walk into today is not the theme park that you walked into 20 years ago. So your methods should serve your mission, not the other way around. So here's the warning you need to keep in mind, okay? Churches that love their methods more than their mission will die. So the first thing you're going to focus on is mission over methods. Mission over methods. Okay, here's the second thing you need to focus on. Embrace the truth, don't dilute it. There's a growing drift toward diluting the message of the gospel in a lot of dying churches. It's just the truth. If you're a traditional church, maybe there's been a little bit of gospel dilution. Now, when Jesus becomes a way to God, not the way to God, the world begins to wonder, well, what do you really stand for, right? Think about it this way. If you were to convert to Buddhism, if I would want to become a Buddhist, not like a diet Buddhist or a Buddhist light, or, if you're converting to Islam or to Judaism, wouldn't you want to go all in? It's like, I want to know what the real thing is. Don't dilute it for me. And when church leaders dilute the gospel, the message loses its power. It's not the gospel anymore. So biblical conviction is more powerful than theological compromise. In fact, there was a recent study done that showed that churches that are a little bit stricter on doctrine tend to do better than churches that are looser. And all you have to do is look across the American landscape and you'll see lots of churches that are sort of wishy-washy theologically. Now, that doesn't mean you need to be mean. That doesn't mean you need to be cruel. That doesn't mean you need to be abusive. What it does mean is that the gospel is the gospel. The truth is the truth. Jesus is the way, not a way. You can be very accommodating to people who have different views, but if that conviction is at the heart of what you do, you're going to see a lot more progress because you're being the authentic church. And authentic churches, biblically, are the churches that are growing right now, and there's a good reason for that. Third point, don't let belief squash faith. Okay, I know this sounds like heresy, but often what you have left in a traditional church is people who believe, and that's wonderful. Okay, good. You believe in God. That's great. But it's not enough. Often debate in traditional churches is characterized by positions of what is culturally right and wrong, or what is liberal versus what is conservative, or some doctrine or interpretation people are very passionate about. So if you get into very conservative traditional churches, they're like, we're all about these rules. Or you go into liberal traditional churches and they're like, well, we just believe in these things, right? Now, what gets lost in the process is that you're focused on doctrine, but you kind of lost faith, right? Faith is trust. It's believing God for something rather than simply believing God. You need to believe God, but you need to believe God for something. It's an active living faith, not something that, just some doctrine that you're resurrecting from 50 years ago. So if you're really going to see renewal, it's going to take faith. You've got to train people to trust in a living God. God, what do you want to do in this generation? God, what do you want to do with this mission? Okay. Belief, if you're just holding up to some, doctrinal statement that somebody developed 852 years ago, can get in the way of faith, saying, God, what are you doing in this generation? What are you calling our church to do? So you really want to elevate faith. And sometimes, that belief is just about preferences. They're not even particularly theological. They're just like, we like these songs, or we like this architecture. You got to get faith above just what you believe. Yes, even the demons believe in God and they shudder, right? We read that in scripture. You got to get people to trust God. And trust means usually leaving what is familiar for a different future. So you want to elevate trust. Fourth point, stop calling ineffectiveness faithfulness. I hear this all the time. It kind of drives me crazy, all right? Leaders claiming we're small because we're faithful. Okay, let's be clear. Size and faithfulness are not correlated. You can be large and faithful, or small and unfaithful, or you can be large and unfaithful and you can be small and faithful. But small does not mean that you're the remnant holding on and you're the only ones who really have it right. Okay, the real question isn't about size, it's about impact and effectiveness. And so you got to ask yourself, are we faithfully maximizing our impact with the resources that God has given us? Small can be strategic. There's nothing wrong with small church. Vast majority of churches are small, but ineffectiveness should never be baptized to become faithfulness. Don't let people get away with calling ineffectiveness faithfulness. It's like, well, we're the only ones left. We're faithful. It's like, maybe you're just ineffective. Okay. You want to gently point that out as a pastor. You want to be kind, but it's like, hey, we're being called to something else here. We're being called to a future. Finally, number 5, replace criticism with curiosity. There is a persistent suspicion in traditional, particularly small dying churches in that culture, that growing churches, the church down the road, that's big, they sold out. Okay. That's what people believe. It's like, we're just critics of anybody who's succeeding. We're just critical, because here's what they did, right? They watered down their teaching. They've embraced entertainment. They've compromised their values. So often small churches feel defensive, and then they get very critical of churches that are growing. Now, here's a radical idea, and this is what we did at those 3 little churches. Instead of getting critical, we got curious. I went out, and then I started bringing, literally at some points, busloads of people to talk to church leaders and to meet Christians whose lives have been transformed in these churches. I mean, okay, instead of criticizing it, let's all get in a bus and let's go visit this church and let's go figure out what they're doing right, because clearly they're reaching people, right? And what we discovered when we got there is authentic, deep conversion stories that rival anything in church history. Because what I learned, and what the people that I have the privilege of serving learned, is when you stop criticizing other Christians' motives and start learning from their successes, everybody wins. And not everything translated to our context, but I'll tell you, it really, really helps. So those are 5 things that I hope are really going to help you. And yes, get the lights, change your preaching, change the music, et cetera, set up that social media account. But if you start to tackle things like that, you're going to see real progress. So if you are a young pastor, a next gen leader, and there's a lot, I want to leave you with a few steps today. First, reflect on this. Okay. Maybe grab your phone, jot down one belief you hold about your church that needs a fresh perspective. Or maybe it's not a belief you hold. Maybe it's a belief they hold, and that needs a fresh perspective. Second thing you can do is don't go this alone. Build your support circle. Seek out a community of like-minded leaders who are navigating similar challenges. And then the third thing is strategically learn and grow. Commit to diving deeper, learning something new this month, because the change, honestly, it starts with you as a leader, all right? If you're inheriting a traditional church, they've been in that pattern for years, if not decades. So the change is probably going to start in you and then spread to a few other leaders and then spread out from there. Now, I have something called the Art of Leadership Academy, and I think it's a great place for you to accomplish the second and the third objective. That is community and also learning and growing. It's a great place for you to find tons of resources that we produced for you. And the importance is picking one and then committing to action, and you're going to have an incredible community. Here's the hope. The traditional church's greatest days could still be ahead. So could the church you're leading. Their greatest days could still be ahead, but that future belongs to those willing to change everything except their core message and their mission. The question isn't whether traditional churches can thrive again, it's whether they will be willing to make the shifts necessary to do so. And these 5 shifts will get you started.